Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan. In today's episode, we're going to look at why the first Christians didn't go to church. Step back in time with me to 56 AD. You're a tent maker in Corinth, Thursday evening, and you're walking through a narrow stone alley toward a house you've been to dozens of times. You can already smell the bread, you hear voices, maybe 15, 20 people, crowded into a dining room built for 8. Someone's brought wine. Someone else brought fish. A formerly enslaved woman is sitting next to a Roman soldier. And nobody seems to think that's odd. A man named Timothy is reading a letter out loud, slowly, because most people in the room can't read. And the letter is from a guy named Paul. And it starts with a greeting to the church that meets in the house of Priscilla and Aquila. That's it. That's church. No building, no steeple, no pulpit, no pews, no worship set, no parking lot, no announcements. Just a house, a meal, and a letter. And for roughly the first 300 years of Christianity, this was the norm. Not the exception, but the norm. There were no church buildings. And it's not because Christians couldn't afford them. We know there were some wealthy early followers of Christ. Not because they were in hiding, because that wasn't always the case. But I think it's because it hadn't occurred to anyone that you needed one. The Christ followers in Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Antioch, they didn't go to church, as we would say today. They gathered as the church. And the difference between those two phrases is not wordplay. When the New Testament uses the Greek word ekklesia, which we translate as church, it never refers to a building. Not once. It refers to people, a gathered assembly. In fact, the word existed long before Christianity borrowed it. In the Greek-speaking world, an ecclesia was a civic assembly. Citizens called out from their homes to gather and make decisions together. So when Paul writes to the ecclesia in Thessalonica, he's not writing to an address. He's writing to a living network, a group of people whose faith had made them a kind of family. And that family ate together constantly. And this is one of those things that sounds quaint until you take it seriously. The central act of early Christian worship was a full meal. Not a symbolic wafer, not a little thimble of grape juice that you peel back that little plastic piece. An actual dinner shared around a table. And they called it a number of different things. Lord's Supper, the love feast, the breaking of bread. But whatever you called it, it was food. Real food. And it was inseparable from worship. Singing, prayer, teaching, prophecy, confession, it all happened around the table. The meal was the gathering. You didn't eat and then worship. Eating together was worship. And this happened in homes. Wealthy patrons, often women, opened their houses. These weren't mega structures. A typical Roman domus might hold 30 people if everyone squeezed in. A wealthier home with a courtyard, maybe 50. That was a large church, but most were a lot smaller, which meant something that's easy to overlook. Everyone knew each other. Not, oh, I've seen you in the lobby before. Oh, I think we were in line together in the coffee shop. No, they knew each other, knew each other's names, trades, families, sins, and struggles. There was no anonymity. You couldn't sit in the back because there was no back. And it's easy to go a long time without noticing what that implies. Because when your church is 30 people in a living room and you share a meal every time you meet, your faith isn't a compartment of your life. It is your life. The early Christians didn't have a church life and a regular life. Those categories simply didn't exist. If someone in the community lost their job, the community fed them. If someone was sick, the community showed up. If a widow needed housing, the community figured it out. It wasn't a program. It wasn't a benevolence committee. It was just what happened when your church was small enough to see everyone and honest enough to know what they needed. Acts chapter 2 describes this. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. That's not a missions initiative that a church has. That's just a lifestyle. And it grew not because of marketing, but because people in the Roman Empire saw it, but they couldn't explain it. Why would a Greek merchant share his table with an enslaved person? Why would a Jewish woman break bread with a Gentile soldier? The empire didn't have a framework for that. The community itself was the sermon. But then around the year 313, something happened that changed everything. The emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan, and then he started building, literally. Constantine commissioned enormous basilicas, grand public halls modeled on Roman government buildings. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Suddenly, Christians had structures. They were magnificent: stone, marble, columns, elevated platforms for clergy. And almost overnight, the posture of Christian gatherings shifted. In a home, you sit in a circle, everyone can speak, the meal is communal. But in a basilica, there's a stage and an audience. One person talks, everyone else listens. The architecture itself reorganized the theology. The leader went from being a host to being a performer, and the congregation went from being participants to being spectators. Nobody voted on this, no one debated it. The buildings just reshaped everything. Because what Constantine built wasn't just a new venue for the same faith, it was a new container, and the contents changed to fit it. The shared meal shrank. Eventually, it became a symbolic ritual, a wafer, sip of wine, administered by a priest. The table disappeared, the participatory gathering became a service, and church quietly, irreversibly became a place you go rather than a people you belong to. And by the 4th and 5th centuries, the transformation was almost complete. Clergy wore distinct clothing, worship followed a formal liturgy. The congregation was passive in the building. The building became sacred space, consecrated, holy ground, which I think would have baffled Paul, because in his world, the ground wasn't holy, the people were. Church wasn't a place you attended, it was a life you shared. And here's what's a bit disorienting about this. Almost every assumption modern Christians carry about church comes after this shift. The idea that church happens on Sunday morning. The idea that one person preaches and everyone else listens. The idea that worship is a set of songs performed from a stage. The idea that going to church is a distinct activity separated from the rest of your week. None of this is original. All of that is inherited from Constantine's architects, from medieval liturgists, from Reformation era reformers who changed the theology but kept the stage. Even the most contemporary, casual, fog machine equipped church plant in 2026 is still structurally a basilica. One stage, one speaker, rows of seats, an audience. The technology changed, furniture changed. They now have coffee, but the layout did not. So here's the question: what did we lose? Not what do we gain? Because we gained a lot: organization, scale, cathedrals that still make people weep, theological precision forged in church councils, global reach, stability. And I don't think those things are nothing. Those are incredibly important. But I do think there was a trade: the intimacy of 30 people around a table, the impossibility of hiding, the obligation to know and be known, the collapse of social hierarchy that happens when a senator eats beside a slave and calls her sister. The meal, the actual filling, nourishing meal that made worship something you could taste. We didn't lose church, we redefined it. And maybe the redefinition was inevitable. Maybe you can't sustain house church intimacy at scale. Maybe the movement needed buildings to survive persecution or literacy or the collapse of Rome. Maybe structure was the immune system that kept Christianity alive. But you don't have to reject the structures to wonder if something got left behind in the transition. You don't have to start meeting in your living room to notice that the earliest Christians wouldn't recognize most of what we call church, and that what they were doing was something stranger, smaller, harder, and more demanding than anything a building can contain. The early church didn't go to church, they were the church. And if that's true, if ecclesia was never a building, never a service, never a Sunday obligation, then the question isn't whether our churches are doing it right. The question is what we're talking about when we say the word. And that's not a question with a clear answer, which is probably why it's worth sitting with for a while. Thanks for listening to the Theology Made podcast. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on.